Okay, so welcome to our podcast. We're going to be talking about the Vampire Diaries and its witchy components.
So the Vampire Diaries is an American teen drama with supernatural main characters consisting of vampires, werewolves, and witches. It ran from 2009 to 2017, and it consisted of 8 seasons.
It's based on a book series that was written by L.J. Smith, but the TV show is it uses a lot of the components, but it's not necessarily by the book per se. Like, a lot of the plot and characters aren't as they were described in the books. But the main characters we're focusing on are Bonnie Bennett, who is, I think she's 16 when we start the show off because she's a sophomore in high school, but she is a black witch in the series. And we also have her Grams, who's her maternal grandmother, who is like the main person who's informing Bonnie of her heritage, and like this is against her father's wishes basically. Wishes.
We also have Professor Shane. He's introduced in season 4, and he's a professor at Bonnie's college. He teaches occult studies and is very much obsessed with witches. He tries to become a mentor towards Bonnie, but things don't necessarily go as planned.
No, but he was obsessed with... I think he was obsessed because he was married to a witch who... She died practicing a form of dark magic, so he has devoted his entire career, basically, to studying witches and, like... Obviously, there's a bunch of other plot components that go into why this is relevant, but, like, that's his main background.
Yeah, and he does become very obsessed with kind of involving himself in Bonnie's magic and trying to kind of, I would say, manipulate it.
He insinuates himself into her life 100%. And it's like, there's, like, a creepy professor-student dynamic going on there where they're, like, doing private lessons in his office and stuff like that. So it's just an interesting dynamic. But they have a lot of the common witch components. Like, he kind of brings about a lot of, like, the relics that are relevant to, like, the history of witchcraft, I guess, in, like, the show. Or I'm not sure how accurate it is. I don't think it's very accurate at all.
Yeah, but he does kind of provide a bit of the history. And we also, like, there's a scene where they kind of go in on one of his lessons, and he does provide a bit of background on witches and, like, the actual culture surrounding witches, so we thought that was interesting as well.
The introduction to that class actually sounded a lot like our first class for this class, which was really funny.
Yeah,
like when we watched the scene back, it's like, witches, what comes to mind? It's like, he makes a joke like, oh, your ex-girlfriend, yeah, that's a witch. Cool. But the main history for like the witches that we get into in Virginia specifically, this is where the show takes place. It's a made-up town called Mystic Falls, and they get into some of the history from like Salem, not very deeply because it's not super like relevant to the current plot that's happening, but we get a little bit of background from Bonnie's Grams about her heritage that happened in Salem and them fleeing from the witch trials and stuff like that.
Yeah, specifically, at one point her Grams actually says, our family first fled from Salem in 1692 and relocated here. Our ancestors lived here in secrecy for over 100 years. It's important that we still do. And that was in the episode titled Haunted.
I think that was, like, a very relevant thing, too, because some of witchcraft and some of what we've gotten into as well is, like, and we'll get into it more later, but natural magic and the location of being where your ancestors were. So, like, leaving Salem was a big decision for them, but more importantly, now that they're relocated in Virginia, staying there so that their family has, like, basis there, essentially, I guess. Because they do have ancestors in Virginia as well, I think.
Yeah, from what she has said, I mean, they don't fully elaborate too deeply into it, but from what she has said, it seems like they had been in Virginia for quite some time, and that the original, like, migration from Salem...
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But a huge thing of the witches is, like, their importance to the story, because witches are always coming to the rescue in the show. Like, that is their main existence.
Yeah, pretty much in the show, whenever something goes badly, the immediate thought is to kind of just go to Bonnie, specifically, since she is one of the main characters. But in every single instance, even with unrelated characters, it seems like witches are somehow involved in kind of remedying the situation.
And even if it's not, like, the immediate thing, it always ends up being, like, the last-minute Hail Mary, like, oh, well... Bonnie can probably do something about this, because Bonnie always has a solution to everything, which, mind you, gets Bonnie in a lot of trouble, because she dies, like, spoiler alert, she dies multiple times in the show. Comes back to life, dies, risks her own life multiple times.
Yeah, it does seem like every single extremely dangerous situation does end up falling on the witches, which is quite interesting. Anything that's a little more tame, they usually kind of handle themselves as like vampires or werewolves, but the second that things
super
get
speed they can handle.
Yeah, whenever things get dire though, it's immediately like, let's call the witch, which is interesting.
100%, yeah. But they do have the upper hand, which is why I feel like they're always coming to the rescue, is because there isn't a problem you could name or a conflict that they face in the show that a witch couldn't solve.
Yeah,
like, there's nothing.
from like all the backstory that they introduce in the show, it seems like witches are the most powerful supernatural beings in the show. So they are kind of the ones who are frequently coming in and kind of overpowering any type of magic or supernatural things that are going on in these situations.
Yeah, that kind of speaks to the versatility as well, because they have like many different, like, and I feel like as the show goes on we get more elements of this introduced, but like when she first starts out we never really see talismans used as like a source of magic or a source of power for her. But as it keeps going on, it's like, oh well, like this rock has blood from an ancestor of mine or something, and this is super useful to this spell. It's
very,
like, oh cool.
Very quickly becomes like a very powerful thing in the show. Anything that has to do with witches, or like more specifically their ancestry and like powerful witches of the past, I would say, who always seem to have like some sort of relation to each other also.
Yeah, and witches in terms of like the, what would you call it, like the food chain almost, or like the power dynamic, do always have the upper hand as well, because vampires can't get around in the day without a daylight ring. So there's this whole subspecies of the supernatural community that literally can't exist without witches, A, being the ones to create them if we go that far back, but also being the ones to give them the ability to walk around during daylight and like be members of like any kind of social circle, basically.
Yeah, and a similar situation goes for the werewolves, where they're not really in control of when they actually change into a werewolf.
Yep. And
they actually have to wait till like the full moons and stuff like that. So they don't really have this constant power that witches do in this story.
Yeah, and we're not talking about, there's a spin-off show called The Originals, but one of the brief things that I will say, because the werewolf point is in that show, which has similar characters, a lot of the same ones when they cross over, is they have like a werewolf thing where the witches are basically controlling when the werewolves turn. They have like stones, they make them rings that are similar actually to the daylight rings that the witches make for the vampires, but they control, they're like moonstone rings or whatever, and it's like for them to not turn unless it's a full moon, or to not turn at all if they choose to.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting as well. It seems like with the vampires and the werewolves, they have like their weaknesses. And it's interesting that the witches can actually come in and use their magic to almost take away those weaknesses. Like in terms of the vampires, they can make them the daylight ring that allows them to walk around during the day.
Exactly. And there's very few weaknesses for the witches themselves. I feel like besides overexertion and like there's a few things, like obviously bringing people back from the dead, there's always a big cost for it. But like other than that, there's not like many limitations that it's like, oh, they, like, the vampires and werewolves have these big things where, oh, I can't walk in the sun, or I turn every full moon, but the witches don't have anything like that really weakens them to a certain extent.
Yeah, and that's definitely the reason that they do have, like, the most power in this universe, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say there's also very few bad apples for the witches. Like, we have Bonnie, we have Grams, we have a bunch of other witches that come in, like, later on, but there's very few conflicts I can think of in the show that are driven by witches, because they're usually trying to keep the balance of nature. That's always their main goal.
Yeah, that's true.
So unless they have personal motives that are bad.
That is true. There has been very few situations of that, but in the most part, it does seem like they're mostly bringing themselves into these situations to almost solve the bigger problem.
Yeah, it seems like there's this unspoken thing for all the witches in the show that it's like the purity almost of magic has to be retained. Like they don't like to disturb the balance of nature, because that's where they get their power. And that's like they have this whole thing with like the ancestors that kind of come in and like redirect them sometimes. Like when Bonnie starts going down a bad path of like darker magic, we see these ancestors like shaking her, like, do not do that, basically. Like that's disrupting the fabric of everything we get our power from, like, don't do that.
And there's also the concept of like nature will like put itself back into balance. So if they cause like a large enough disruption, there has been like consequences, I would say, in some of the episodes.
Definitely. Especially like one of the main things I can think of is when she brought Jeremy back from the dead. She died herself. But that was an accident, because it was like she was trying to revive him, and then it was like, well, nature always finds a balance, so clearly you're dead now.
It wasn't something she necessarily was aware of, but she had been warned that something
bad
would happen as a result, and it did make sense that like for one life another was taken like in turn to kind of like resolve that unbalanced situation. But yeah, that's like the main situation in which that came up, I would say.
Yeah, and in terms of nature magic too, we see a lot of the elements that are common with witchcraft, like the candles that are always used for spells, and like for locator spells, which they do every 5 minutes on the show.
Yeah,
they lose everybody, and it's like, instead of find my friends, we need a locator spell, like every time.
The witches are turned to for that as well.
Yeah, like, here, just give me their hairbrush, I'll find them. Like, we'll figure it out.
It's the immediate.
Or like blood, like we see, was it Elena, I think, cut her hand on like a map one time to like find Jeremy, because they're like blood related, so she like puts some blood on a map, and Bonnie does some witchy woo, and like it magically moves on the map because it's the blood that's related, obviously.
Yeah, there actually is, like, a lot of use of blood in the show, surprisingly, but it's never, like,
all the time
tied into any type of, like, devil worship or, like, satanic elements. Like,
Never.
It's more just used in the sense of, like, personal ties, having, like, more of that, like, nature magic type of... it's not ever used in, like, a...
religious way.
Yeah.
There's never any undertone of, like we see a lot with the stuff we've been doing with Puritans and that kind of thing in class. We never really see any elements of that are translated over. It's always natural magic and, like, drawn from the earth. It's never has to do with God. We never really have any religious characters either that come in and are, like, upset with the use of magic or anything like that. Like, it's never even introduced as a conflict.
Yeah, there's really no religious ties at all. It's more, like, used as, like, a healing type of magic, I would say, and to some extent it's also has more, like, psychic undertones, things of that
Definitely
nature.
Psychic undertones.
It's not really... I'm, like, losing my train of thought right now.
No, you're good.
I don't know why.
They also use a lot of personal effects. Like, the hairbrush thing was one of them, but, like, you can use... There's a bunch of things that they use in the show. I'm trying to think of some examples that are, like, specific, but definitely drawing things from, like, personal affects that are... Like, there's the idea in most forms of magic that you impress something personal upon an object when you own it, I guess. So, like, they use... like, necklaces, like that necklace that Elena had for ages, for some reason, was, like, a massive source of, like, power.
Yeah, you're right. I remember. Like, it's a lot of jewelry, which is interesting.
Jewelry's a huge one, yeah. I actually never really singled that out, but you're totally right. Because jewelry's, like, I mean, the rings, for one, the necklace.
Rings, the necklace. There's a couple, and they also...
A lot of talismans like that.
Bracelets. Anything that they can use for protection. That's a big thing.
Vervain bracelets, you're totally right, yeah. I wonder if they spilled those bracelets or if they, like, just soaked them in vervain. Vervain is the thing that's used to, like, deter vampires. Like, you know, in, like, common, it's, like, garlic or something that drives them away. In this show, it's vervain. Which no one knows what that is, but it's an herb.
It's not really as common of an element.
Yeah, no. But they use herbs. I think there's a few times they use herbs in the show where it's, like, definitely, I would say in originals more than Vampire Diaries, maybe, because there's, like... They're like, go get me a ginger root. And it's like, what are you going to use that for?
I wouldn't say that herbs are really focused on in the Vampire Diaries. There's a lot of spells. I think that's, like, the main thing. I mean, they always have, like, the objects that are connected to the person. But it's mostly, like, she has her spell books, like, things like that. Like, that's really where, like, the magic itself... Not the magic itself, but, like, the instructions come from, I would say. And they don't really tend to involve, like... objects aside from, like, the witch herself, like Bonnie in this case.
Yeah, especially even I'm thinking about it now, the herbs are really not really to do with the witches at all. If you think about vervain, well, if you go back far enough, sure, but the vervain and the wolfsbane both don't really have to do directly with spells from witches or any
they do
ritual.
Have, like, magical properties, I would say, but they're not like directly needed to actually perform any of these, like, spells that are frequently used in the show.
Yeah. You just said something about spellbooks, and I forgot completely, but the grimoires that are in the show are super, super relevant to... They're like, I think Damon calls them, who's one of the vampires in the show, a witch's cookbook at one point, which is, like, all the ingredients and, like, instructions for the spells that a witch will do, like, in their lifetime. And I think it's by, like, family, almost, that they do them, because it's, like, they have the Bennett grimoire, which is, like, all of her family, like, her grams and stuff, spells that are relevant for them, because I feel like it's not a very cross-cultural... Like, it's not something people really share, I guess, in the witch community, is, like, grimoires.
Yeah, it does seem like it's something that's passed down through generations, which kind of just further goes into that, like, very, like, specific historical... I don't know what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, specific historical makes sense. I think because it also has to do with, like, the spells themselves. I feel like they have a lot of, when they're saying them in the show, like, the Latin roots that they use, almost. But I'm wondering now, because we're talking about it, if each family has different, like... ways of saying spells, or if this is, like, a universal thing that, like, oh, if you want to, like, do a locator spell, it's this, or if it's, like, different ways to do it, like, culturally.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. I'm not sure
we never really actually
they don't really elaborate further on that. They kind of just explain that, like, these books are passed down through generations. They don't really go further into, like, where they originated from, or if there's any similarities, or if there's any cross... I don't know. It's definitely something that's pretty vague in the actual contents.
We do meet another witch family that comes on. I think this is, like, really early in the season, but Luca and his father who come to town, who are also witches, and they come with their own grimoire. They've got a separate agenda, but it seems like Luca and Bonnie did spells together, and I think they were saying the same spells. And I think it did the same thing, and they, like, had a... I'm not sure if they were related far back. That might have been part of the plot, but I have no idea.
Yeah, not that we
Everyone's related.
That's what it seems like.
Yeah.
Not that we saw, but I guess that is a good point. It does seem like maybe the spells are the same, and it's just kind of something that each family records for themselves. Yeah, in that type of way, but it actually is, like, the same translations, I guess, for each of them. I don't know.
We do have witches, like, when we talk about Esther, when Esther's the original witch, she's, like, the first witch, basically, in history. It sounds like her and her sister Dahlia, and that's more in the originals that they get into that history. But her grimoire has, like, a bunch of revolutionary things that are not common for other witches. They're, like, elite spells, basically, that have, like, different symbols that are associated with them, or, like, different creative things. It's, like, almost if you're an artist and you're a witch, it's, like, you go about spells in a completely different way, and you have a different process for, like, writing them down and, like, making weird spells, maybe, like, things that other people don't use, maybe.
Yeah, it seems like there's actually a lot more, like, deeper detail to these grimoires that we don't really get to elaborate on in the show, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, but they are very, like, valuable. Like, when they lose it or, like, need to find someone's, it's, like, a huge deal. Like, they are very, very sought after in the show a few times with, like, different ones.
Yeah, they do hold a lot of value, and I guess, like, that might be in part by, like, the actual power that comes along with it, because if there's a potential to be some, like, I guess you could say new spells in another grimoire, that kind of gives a witch more power, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Having more... Because it's not even, like... How do I put this? You don't have... It's not that you're more powerful, it's that your power has more applications, maybe?
Yeah.
So you can kind of do different things with it.
Yeah, no, I agree. That makes perfect sense.
But we see a lot of similar elements, even if it's different witch families, with the things that happen around them when they're casting a spell. Like when they're doing magic.
Yeah, that's good to know. Especially with Bonnie, whenever there's a more powerful spell, I guess, being done, we notice a lot of movement around her in terms of the wind or the leaves. There's always, like, nature seems to react to the power that these spells hold, which we thought was really interesting, considering that the whole show kind of highlights what would be considered nature magic. So we thought that was just kind of an interesting touch to see how it kind of all does tie together with the world around them.
Yeah, definitely. You'll see her almost light herself on fire, low-key, with, like, she'll have, like, candles around her to, like, do a spell. Like, almost every spell she does, I would say, has, like, a semicircle of candles.
Yeah, you're right, fire, too.
And the fire just shoots up, and it's like, okay, it's totally gonna light her hair on fire. Like, please don't do that. And her nose starts bleeding, like, 90% of the time. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. It does seem like there is a bit of, like, a reaction almost to, like, the level of power that we see.
It's almost like it's draining her. Like, she's drawing from nature, but it's drawing from her as well, because it's like she looks very fatigued after a spell. A lot of the times it takes a lot out of her.
Because I guess at this point, like, she would be almost like an element of nature. You know what I mean?
Yeah, she's like channeling all that, and maybe having all that run through her almost is exhausting.
Yeah.
Because you see that a lot with the big spells. Like, she'll pass out after.
Yeah, it's always the more powerful spells. The littler spells, like, they don't really seem to have much of an effect on her or really anything around them at all. Yeah. But when it comes to something that is a big deal and is usually emphasized as a big deal in the show, we definitely see those similar reactions.
Yeah. And something that happens early on that we don't really see continuing as a theme is, like, those psychic elements too. This is, like, kind of a different topic, but, like, the psychic elements that we see in the very beginning where she meets, like, this is when Bonnie barely knows that she's a witch. Like, her Grams has been telling her, like, and Bonnie's like, yeah, Grams, like, you're crazy, like, I'm not a witch, but her Grams is like, no, like, you're a psychic, like, this has been passed down in our family for generations. And Bonnie has this scene, I think it's in the pilot episode, and she's in the car with Elena, and she's like, I predicted, like, someone so, like, winning the election, or, like, this person getting this part in this movie. It's, like, stupid things that, like, aren't relevant. But then she meets Stefan, who's a vampire, and she touches him, and she gets all these visions. Yeah,
it definitely starts out very tame and almost kind of more coincidental, I guess you could say. Like,
it was an accident. She wasn't trying to get any visions. But
yeah, like, she kind of presents it more of like, oh, this is really weird that I'm predicting this and this and this. Yeah. But it's not necessarily something that comes along with, like, strictly, like, magical elements in terms of, like, how she is with Stefan. Like, there's actually more of, like, a vision that takes place there. There's not the just, oh, like, the predictions of what's going to happen in the future. Of, and, like, it's these more not important events, I guess you could say.
It's not voluntary either. Like, it, like, takes hold of her almost. It's not something because this is something that's not, she doesn't know what's going on. So she can't really summon this happening. But witches and vampires are, like, they don't refer to them in, like, the religious sense as demons, but they're, like, darker creatures. They obviously are like what goes bump in the night. Like they are only supposed to be confined to like the nighttime because they can't really live in the sun without a magical talisman. But like, I don't know, it's just interesting because the whole thing that happens with Stefan is like fog and crows and like darkness. Basically, she's like, I felt death when I touched him, and it's like, okay, that's a bit dramatic maybe.
That was kind of like the first moment where her powers went from like kind of nothing that was too out of the ordinary, I guess you could say, to something that like really confirmed that like things are a little bit weirder than expected, I guess you could say. Which
is common, I think, with like a lot of the coming of age stuff when you see which things is like something random happens. Like, did you watch Halloween Town as a kid? This is like similar, but like Marnie and her grandmother, like things happen for Marnie and she's like, what's going on? And her grandmother's like, you're a witch.
It's like kind of like something that like kind of confirms it almost.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't obvious before that, but then something happens and all of a sudden they're like, oh, okay, yeah, this is probably the case now.
Yeah,
and definitely. It seems like that was like that moment for her.
Like symptoms of witchcraft almost, like things that wouldn't be normal for anyone else.
Yeah, pretty much.
And like we see some flashbacks and visions as well. Like she does get, like when she touches people sometimes there's like other visions besides like just flashes of things, but like not as often in the show, as because it really fades out after the first season. There's really no psychic part after that, I feel like.
Yeah, it definitely like starts out more at the beginning to kind of just like introduce the idea of witchcraft in Bonnie's case. It's not really like a continuing theme, because I would say like the visions and like the kind of somewhat psychic abilities were very tame compared to like her powers in later seasons and as the show goes on. So I think it was more of just like an introductory, like how she was easing into that power almost.
Yeah. And this is like, because we don't see a lot of like divination. She's never really trying to like divine the future. So I think that's kind of a contrast, because when we read like Godbeer's history and he was talking about the girls that were orphaned as a result of like those Indian attacks, and they had no dowry to offer, so they were really concerned about like their marital prospects, and they were experimenting with divination to like find who their future husband would be, or like calm themselves down basically that something would turn out okay for them, because like, you know, unmarried back then is like a death sentence. And all of that being interpreted as witchcraft is like kind of crazy, but it's just a contrast basically to what we see in the show.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Although divination isn't quite discussed much in the show, there is the concept of expression that is brought up, and we haven't really quite seen that in anything else we've explored.
Yeah, it's basically just, I think it's the Vampire Diaries version of just dark magic, and like identifying that as, like, they had to give it a name because they can't just call it like dark magic, I guess, but it is dark magic essentially. That's what it consists of.
Yeah, I think it was just something to like, I don't know if they necessarily wanted to label it as dark magic, because I don't know if every single aspect of it would be considered dark. But I think they just wanted to like definitely differentiate from like the normal type of magic that goes on in the show and what's kind of more considered safe magic, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think safe magic is distinguished by like what's balanced in nature. Like anything that's straying from like keeping nature's balance is basically not like a good thing, essentially. Like any kind of magic that does that, that's for like selfish reasons, or for like it's costs too much. Like we see in one of the seasons they have to like kill a bunch of people to channel this spell, and it's like, okay, well that's a really bad basis for a spell. Like that's super evil and really bad, so that's obviously dark magic. But they don't really refer to it as dark magic. They just say it's like really bad, and it can like kill a witch basically. Like
it's definitely warned against, especially by Bonnie's Grams and multiple episodes. She's consistently telling Bonnie that this is not something you want to mess with, because it is something that comes up in relation to like when someone died, like anything that's more questionable, I would say morally, like to bring someone back to life, that's definitely questionable, and it definitely messes with the balance of nature, and that's when expression comes up the most, and it's most prevalent throughout the story at moments like that where like they're really in dire need and they kind of can't look towards anything else. And that's kind of when Bonnie is pushed to kind of take this route, even though it is against her grandmother's wishes, and like she is fully against anything that has to do with expression. That's kind of also why we assume it is dark magic, because it seems to be much more dangerous and like used in these morally questionable situations.
Which is kind of interesting. What do you call it? A juxtaposition, because you see Bonnie trying to help her friends and do all these good things for them, but she has to take really drastic and dark measures sometimes to do that, and it's kind of like it kind of splits her in two sometimes, because she's like, I don't really know, like obviously I have this loyalty to my friends, and she always does, and she always comes through for them, but it's like at what cost, you know?
Yeah, that's what's crazy. They do kind of push her, I would say, to
the limit.
Some crazy limits with some of these things, and she always does pull through for them, but it, like, even like, spoiler, I guess you could say, but like in the case of spoiler. Well, yeah, all of this is spoiler. But in the case of bringing Jeremy back to life, like that was expression, and
100%. She didn't even know it yet, but
she didn't know it yet. She somewhat did a little bit. Her grandmother did say like, this is not something you want to do.
Yeah.
But she still knew that for her friend's sake, and I guess even for her own sake too. Like, this is what she had to do, and like that. I mean, she died as a result of that. So like, she definitely was pushed to the limit much more than anybody else in the show, I would say.
Oh, definitely. More than any other witch character, too,
100%.
I would say. And it's also, because you're mentioning Grams warning her, this is also from Beyond the Grave. Like, her Grams has died by this point. Her Grams passed away. I think she passed away in season 3. It's hard to say, I mean, hard to really feel that loss because she's still around in, like, spirit scenes almost and, like, the other side kind of stuff. But even when the other side is, like, technically collapsed and, like, there shouldn't be any spiritual access to anyone who's dead, her Grams still finds a way to, like, reach her. And we have this really, like, haunting scene where her Grams is, like, getting, what is it, like, all the veins pop out and stuff because she's like, this is what your magic is doing to, like, people who practice natural magic. Like, it's really unhealthy. It's not unhealthy. I mean, it's, like, drastic. It's awful.
Yeah, it's definitely, like, a darker path to go down is what she emphasizes.
And that's what killed Professor Shane's wife.
Yeah, which is interesting that Professor Shane was actually the one to teach Bonnie about expression, considering that's...
Well, obviously, he's got his own motives, which is awful, but he's like, you know what? Because he starts teaching her this magic, and he doesn't tell her what it is, and then she gets too far, and she's in too deep, and he's like, yeah, by the way, this magic killed my wife, but, like, I know the warning signs now, so, like, it's chill.
Yeah.
Like, I can help you.
Yeah, I think that's part of the issue, is that he kind of introduced this as, like, well, you already have power, but this kind of extends that power to, like, a fully new level.
Yeah.
And that's something that, at this point in the story, I feel like she was definitely seeking, because there was just these constant situations where she needed more power, and she was always overexerting herself. So I think hearing that there's this type of magic that can give her more power, especially when he wasn't quite explaining that there were many downsides associated with it.
It's like those commercials for, like, medicine where they're like, look at all these great things, and they speed through all the side effects that are super scary.
Like, oh, you can die, but, like, we're not going to
tell you that
too much.
Yeah,
it definitely seemed like a situation like this where he was being heavily manipulative towards her to kind of get what he wanted in the end.
I think that was super aided, though, in that Bonnie doesn't have a lot of witch friends. She doesn't have anyone. All of her friends are vampires, basically. So when she finds someone who, and we see this a lot when she first starts, like, developing this rapport with Professor Shane, is he knows about magic, he studied witches, like, he has all this history and this knowledge of it, and she's like, oh my god, there's someone who shares, like, shared interests, like, oh my god, we have the same ideas.
At this point in the story, her grandma has also passed away, so she doesn't have
a mentor figure.
Yeah, a mentor figure who's willing to work on these spells or, like, her powers in any sense, and, like, that had been her grandma before, so I feel like part of it was also that she was excited to kind of have somebody like that again.
Yeah, especially because her dad, like, the main male figure in her life, like, he's, like, scared of magic, he doesn't like it, he doesn't want her messing with it, like, he thinks the grandmother's crazy for trying to do all that stuff. So I think when she sees this, like, adult figure who's a mentor to her, who's a male, being like, oh my god, magic is so cool, you should definitely do it with me.
Yeah.
Then she's like, oh my god, yeah.
Yeah, it might have been hard for her to kind of see the
red flags.
Yeah, the red flags, all the red flags that he presented and how he was going about things.
Which were many.
Yeah, many.
But that sense of camaraderie is not something she gets a lot, because we do see covens in the show.
Yeah.
But we don't see a lot of... There's a few occasions where they're brought up, but there isn't a ton of, like, witch-on-witch collaboration happening a lot of the time. It's usually just Bonnie.
Rare. And it does seem like the situations in the show that covens are brought up, or there is, like, witches helping each other, is usually when they're, like, in dire need and, like, things are not going to get done unless they have the power for multiple people. But there's not really these situations where it's like, oh, they're just hanging out. Relating on things.
Not.
Like, there's not really that type of coven, I would say, but, like, it's more that they have these people around that, like, they can call on if they really need it, I would say.
Yeah, and it's definitely got a lot to do with, like, family histories, I would say, because there's definitely, like, Bonnie doesn't meet these people at school. Like, it's not something... Yeah, I mean, she meets one guy at school, actually, like that, but typically when she's doing spells with other witches, it's not... It's like, oh, my mom's friend is a witch, and, like, I can call her to help me with this, and it's, like, always a family relation, because it's got to do with the bloodline kind of topic, I suppose.
Yeah. And what's interesting too is like in all these covens it does tend to be like female witches, we've noticed.
Definitely.
But at the same time, like there has been like one instance in which like Luca and his father, they came into the town and they were witches as well. So like there is the concept of male witches in this universe, which we thought was really interesting, although like female witches are the more common witch scene throughout the show.
Remember the scene where it's Luca talking to Bonnie and she's like, oh, you're a witch? Because he does some spell and he goes, well, I'm a warlock. And I was like, okay, well, he's a warlock, but you're a witch. You know, essentially, that was what we're getting at.
Yeah, I did forget about that, but you're right.
It's just funny. No, I just remembered it just now. I was like, he's a witch. I was like, wait a minute. He has some scene where he's sarcastic as hell and he's like, oh, I'm a warlock.
I'm a warlock.
It's like, okay, cool.
Does
that make you feel better about yourself? We can call you a warlock.
That was the first like instance, I feel like, of Bonnie having like a friend who is a witch.
She definitely saw him as more than a friend, eventually.
Well, yeah. But I think, like, what also drew her to him more was the fact that, like, they could relate on that level because she didn't have that with any of her friends or anybody else really in the show that was around her age.
Yeah, and we see a lot of, like, when they do the joint magic scenes, it's all the typical themes of, like, well, the candles are still there, they're holding hands, or, like, they're saying the same incantations together. And, like, there are definitely scenes as well where she's drawing magic from, like, she'll, like, channel power from other people, but it's different than when she's doing magic with another witch.
Yeah, that was kind of the, like, only example we really saw of, like, something more casual and not really, like, a combination of power to, like, achieve something that, like, was out of reach without it.
Yeah. And not, obviously, race isn't super talked about in the show, but Luca is another black witch. Bonnie's black. Bonnie comes from, I mean, both of her parents were black. We meet them both. Her grams is, like, everyone who is a witch who has a history in the community, it seems like, is black. And they don't really talk about the racial heritage, but, like, they do talk about when, like, we're going back to, like, Virginia and, like, very, very older times, they were in service roles.
Yeah. There is, like, somewhat mentioning of it. It's not really, like, a prevalent theme within the show.
Yeah, no.
But there is, like, undertones of, like, some of the history. We don't really go deep into it because I would say, like, most of the history in the show is pretty inaccurate.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah.
So I think that they don't really go further into it for maybe that reason, because it might not necessarily, like, align historically with what they've, like,
because a lot of the witch stuff that we've been talking about in class has to do, I mean, obviously Tituba was black, but not the Puritans, like the women who were accused were all generally, I feel like, the main themes we focused on with Dr. Rockwell's lecture were being white, being, widowed?
Yeah.
Widows
Often
who were
older,
on the outskirts of society, older. Nothing really to do with race specifically, I don't think, was discussed.
Yeah, which is why it is interesting that, like, the show kind of prevalently...
I don't know if they're doing it intentionally or not, but it is definitely a theme I notice when they're doing the show. And it's funny, too, because the original witch is Esther, and she's white. That whole family, the original family, who's, like, the first family of witches and vampires, were white.
Yeah.
And that's another male witch we meet, is Cole. Cole, who is original... he was the original family, I think he was, like, the third youngest son or something. But he was a witch before he was a vampire. So we do see that male witches are a thing, warlocks are a thing, but not nearly as often as we see.
Yeah, they're sprinkled in there, but they're definitely not, like, the focus of any of the plot lines, I would say.
No, definitely not. But we do get some of this, like, history from... When did they say in the show the burning at the stakes happened? I don't know what year that they say. I think it's definitely 1690-ish.
I think 1690-ish. Honestly, like, they're not too historically detailed, I would say.
Definitely
like,
not.
They don't really go far into detail because things are kind of very skewed.
Yeah, definitely.
But, yeah, I would say it was around somewhere in the 1600s is the date I remember being
definitely mentioned. Around this paranoia of witches being a thing, because that is something they talk about in the show with, like, there was paranoia around vampires and there was paranoia around witches. Mm-hmm. They were separate phenomenons, but they were definitely pretty prevalent in those historical communities.
Yeah, especially with Salem being tied in.
Yeah, and these communities, when you see the flashback scenes, look exactly like Salem. Like, this whole village and, like, founding family issue is, like, very Puritan of them.
Yeah, it definitely has the same vibe, I would say, as all of our other stories that focus on Puritans, although those stories might have a bit more historical accuracy.
Definitely.
It's still playing off of those same events that occurred.
Yeah, because they talk about Mystic Falls having a sudden wave of anti-witch hysteria, and they rounded up this group of, like, men and women who were suspected of witchcraft, and they tried them, which I'm gonna put tried in quotations, like, verbally, because, like, as we all know, that probably wasn't accurate.
Yeah.
Tried them as witches and tied them to stakes in a field and lit them on fire.
Yeah. No,
Pretty severe.
Yeah, very severe. It's just, especially, like, the theme of, like, witches being killed or burned at the... It always tends to be fire, whether it be burned at the stake or just, like, burned in a fire. Like, it's always kind of brought up. And Bonnie tends to also bring up the idea that, like, in these locations that these events happen, she can say that she always feels the spirits of the witches who died there.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, true. Like, those spirits, I guess you could say, like, will assist her in spells if they are taking place at those locations.
Yeah.
Which is sometimes necessary.
Oh, definitely. And I feel like a lot of those times we see it's, like, ancestor of hers directly. Like, Emily Bennett is one of the main ones we see at, like, that house that's right near where those witches were burned. We see the spirit of Emily Bennett, like, almost haunting that house, I want to say, because she's, like, always there. I'm not sure how the whole spirit location issue is. I don't know if she, like, lives there in, like, the afterlife really or what, but she's always there.
They're kind of just there, but they're not there, but they're always there and everywhere at the same time. It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it's not historically accurate, as we know, from Dr. Rockwell's lecture. It's not.
It's a lot of the details we find when it comes to the history of the Bennett family or just witches in general. It is a bit skewed, and they like to kind of emphasize the more fictitious parts, I would say, of, like, or fictitious, sorry, parts, I would say, of, like, the witch trials in the U.S. and things like that, kind of just to maybe dramatize it for entertainment purposes, I would say.
Yeah, because we know historically that obviously witches were not burned in America. They were burned in Europe almost exclusively, I think that's the only country that Dr. Rockwell said had burning at the stake. And you know what's even funnier? It's not funny, but they never mention hanging witches in the show, even though that's the only way that witches mainly died, like, mostly. Because
that's true. It's not really a topic that's mentioned. That's also why I say, like, I feel like they did dramatize it for that reason, even though they know it's not necessarily historically accurate. I think it's just, it kind of creates more drama in, like, the witches were burned at the stake, and, like, there's a lot of fire involved in, like, the deaths of witches throughout the plot of the actual story, and, like, it just kind of gives it that more dramatic effect. The hangings, I'm sure, obviously, that would be pretty bad as well, but, like, I think something about including the fire and continuing that theme of, like, fire killing witches is something that's true. Adds to the story.
And it's funny, too, because she draws power from fire, almost. Like, the candles that she lights, it's interesting that we see, like, that's a weird dynamic of this element killed all of your ancestors, basically, and it's something you draw power on frequently.
Yeah, that actually is a really interesting thought.
And we don't tie in a lot of religious aspects either, but fire is typically associated with hell. So it's like, how do we reconcile burning witches? You're adding more satanic elements to what you already believe to be a satanic element.
I know. It's interesting that although, like, certain elements that would be considered satanic, I guess, like the blood and the fire and stuff,
it's weird.
They really don't mention any aspect of that. Like, they don't quite,
which is crazy, actually, that they skirted around it for so long.
I know. It's interesting. They don't really say what the original source of the magic is. It's kind of just, like, they allude to the fact that it's nature, but there's no first instance of this source coming to be, I guess, or being utilized. It's kind of just like, oh, this is, like, how it has been forever, and we don't really know, like, when it started, but
we're not going to question it, but, like, we're just going to use it. Yeah. No, and it's interesting, too. It's just, like, I think it's something that a lot of people believe happened. It's, like, one of the things talked about with Dr. Rockwell being a commonly believed myth that these burnings at the stake happened in other countries and, like, frequently, even though it wasn't really... I mean, I think it was England. England loved to burn their witches, but we didn't really do that. No. We hung them all, apparently.
Yeah, which is what I find interesting. Like, we obviously can't really know if the creators of the show, like, did look into this history. It does seem like they strayed very far from, like, what would be considered historically accurate. So we don't know if that's necessarily, like, a creative choice or if they just didn't really take the time to look further into some of these things.
Yeah, if they didn't want to do the research, really.
Yeah, and they were just kind of going for, like, what sounded good.
Yeah, they kind of just went with, I feel like they went into that writing room and they said, what do we all know about witches? And whether it was fact or fiction, it was included.
Yep.
Yeah, because all of it almost, I would say, is fiction. But it has basis in some of the same themes, obviously, but, like, ultimately it's kind of far-fetched.
Yeah, and I think that's, like, the biggest question we have from all of this is whether this was, like, a creative choice or if there's any, like, underlying reason to, like, going so far off what we would
off script, basically,
fact in this situation.
Yeah, which is interesting too. I think it has something to do with the target audience of the show as well, because obviously we're talking about a teen drama with supernatural characters, and it's like, okay, that's typically I mean, I started watching the show as maybe a sophomore in high school. I was about the supposed age that these characters would have been when I started. And I didn't know anything about witch history then, so I would believe anything they sold me.
I guess that's a good point. I feel like it's not really meant to be like a very factual show.
But it should be.
It should.
It should have more basis in reality,
just a
if
little
I
bit.
had to say.
I feel like would be nice knowing what we know now.
Yeah, definitely. Especially because when you learn about it like this and you're like, oh, that didn't happen. Because I thought witch burnings at the stakes did happen here.
Oh, yeah. Because, I mean, said in almost every single thing.
Like, literally,
every single show, every movie. Not every, but, you know.
No, it's a very
prevalent It's a prevalent theme that, like, is consistently emphasized, but is just so far from the truth, which is interesting.
But it's also, I mean, aside from the fiction, like the fact versus fiction issue that we have going on, there's definitely a lot of, like, when you look at witches as they're conveyed in popular culture as a whole, there's a ton of those elements in the show. Like the fire, the natural elements, the incantations, the talismans, all of that stuff is definitely incorporated. And very, very well, honestly. Yeah. Like, the show is a good show, like, obviously. Yeah. We wouldn't be talking about it for, like, a half hour unless it's a good show. Like, obviously, I like it.
It's a great show, and I mean, like, I could see why some of these elements might have been included, and that's what makes us lean into the idea that maybe it was for, like, the creative purposes, and, like, that's the reason that they kind of skew the truth a little bit, because it kind of does tie a lot of elements of the show together.
Yeah, it does. And it worked for them, ultimately, because clearly the show is very popular and well-received. It ran for 8 seasons. Honestly, it would have ran longer, probably, if it wasn't for, like, the cast being like, okay, let's finish this now.
Yeah, I don't think too many people, honestly, looked at any of the historical accuracies that
but you know what, actually there was a review for the originals about which is the same characters for the most part, and one of the witches, obviously she says the same incantations that Bonnie does, a lot of the spells are the same, and they got, like, a letter from some fan being like, you're summoning the devil with these spells. You are doing terrible things with the, like, please don't have them say these incantations and, like, phrase it that way or have these Latin roots or something like that. Like, they were really, really concerned about, like, the satanic elements that they were, like, summoning almost, I guess. I don't know. It was really I heard that in, like, one of the interviews I watched. I was like, oh god, that's awful.
I did not know that.
Yeah, but I bet there was a lot of people like that. Like, just like when you have shows like Suits where it's, like, legal jargon and stuff and they're just throwing it around, you're going to get letters from fans that are like, listen, this isn't accurate, or, like, please stop.
Yeah, it's just interesting how this show seems to have, like, gone so... I think that's also partially why they don't really elaborate on certain things, though, because...
Definitely. They'll get feedback that's not good.
Yeah, because they don't really go into detail, because I feel like the details just would not be able to be accurate with, like, the current history that they present us with.
Especially because they DIY'd their own history for, like, the whole show.
They took pieces that they liked and then just kind of were like, we're not really going to talk about the rest of it.
And they were in too deep at that point. They're like, okay, well, we already said that they were burned at the stake. We can't say that never happened.
Yeah, let's just consistently go with the burning.
Yeah, and they kept that theme for the whole thing, because I feel like that was a recurring topic that kept coming up in the show.
100%.
Yeah. Same with the spirits of the witches. Anytime there was a seance early in the show.
That's true, yeah.
I don't know if it was successful. I think it wasn't, but, like, they tried to have a seance.
They attempted it, at least.
Yeah. But, like, themes like that are common with witchcraft, and, like, these spells are always in the show. Every episode has something new, I feel like, with the witches.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think they go for, like, any type of witchy stereotype. They kind of just try to integrate it somewhere. Yeah. Whether or not it's factually accurate or anything along those lines, they just throw it in there because people will be amused by it.
I was amused.
It worked.
They thoroughly amused me for 8 seasons. But yeah, no, I mean, overall the show is just, I think it's a good portrayal of witches overall. I mean, Bonnie's a very strong female character. We see her have a lot of loyalty to her friends and, like, independence from her, like, family. Even though her family, like, her Grams is the one who teaches her all this magic, she becomes this, I mean, very capable young woman with extraordinary power because she's from a very, like, notable witch family. But, like, as a character, she just does the stereotype a ton of justice, I think.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And I think that there isn't really a fear of witches in this show. It's more that they're actually turned to for help in these situations. They don't really have this fear surrounding them that we've seen in all these other stories. And it is obviously, like, a more modern portrayal by far compared to everything else.
Definitely, yeah.
So that could also play into it, but overall it is a good portrayal of witches overall.
Yeah, because we see in, like, Tituba and Heart in Her Hands, those two characters are feared for their power. Accused of witchcraft, and then we see, obviously, with the Heart in Her Hands, her family and, like, the elders being scared of her for breaking the stereotypes almost and, like, having power. So it's like when you see a witch like Bonnie, who is capable, who is intelligent, and able to, like, have this power without going crazy or, like, angering everybody around her. It's a really interesting balance to strike, and, I mean, goes into the nature balancing, I guess, is, like, she's just cool.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also interesting that, like, even though her father, like, is against some of the things she does, it's not necessarily from the perspective of, like, he doesn't want her to have this power. It's more that he just fears, like, what this power may do to her, which we do see the effects of that. So, like, his fear definitely makes sense. It's not really that he's afraid of, like, what she is capable of, but more just how that would affect her in the end.
That's super salient with the expression stuff that goes on in that season. And it's also, I think he worries about it, not even just the expression stuff, but with natural magic and just constantly being the savior. Like, massive martyr complex for her friends. Like, he's worried that she's just going to sacrifice herself probably out of the blue. And she would, and she has.
Like, he's
rightfully.
He has seen these things actually play out exactly how he expects.
Yes. So. He's got reason to worry about it, for sure. And she's missing... Grams is definitely a great mentor, but missing her mother figure, because her mother, she split, like, when she was a kid, I think.
Yeah, she...
Really, really young.
Yeah.
But we see Grams take over that role for a big part of it, so it works out. And Bonnie's just... Honestly, that's, like, the main witch we've been talking about, because that's... I could get into, like, Freya and all the other witches that are in, like, some of the spin-offs and stuff, but Bonnie's really, like, the OG, like, when you're talking about the Vampire Diaries as a show, and, like... this portrayal of witches in popular culture and, like, how they're conveyed, and, like, they just did a great job, I think, with Bonnie, and having that racial diversity as well for having her be a witch, because a lot of the shows, like Sabrina the Good Witch or something?
Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
The Teenage Witch, yeah. She's white, blonde, like, classic, you know what I mean? Like, American Girl. You don't want every portrayal of witches to be like that.
Yeah, no, I think they also do a great job of emphasizing, like, her and her entire family line. Like, it's not just like, oh, she's powerful. It's her entire family was known to be, like, probably the most powerful from what we've seen.
I think it is it is the most, and I think it partially has to do with some of the spells that her ancestors did, like, just, like, really helpful things for communities, like locking away super powerful vampires and things like that. And it's like, okay, this spell that they did, like, ages and ages ago has a blood lock, so, like, you're super special because only your blood can, like, unlock that, basically. Like, you hold a ton of power just by, like, the virtue of what's come before you, essentially.
And it does seem like they, like, that power is given to them in the sense that, like, they have done good things with their power and it has made them stronger somehow.
Yeah, exactly, because, I mean, strength in numbers.
Yeah.
You see she has all these random witch friends and, like, community people that she can reach out to, and it's because she's not a terrible person.
Exactly. Even though
doesn't do bad things with their power.
Around the entire time, like, they do show up when needed. We see a lot.
And there's definitely a huge girl power part to the show in terms
100%.
of, we see, like, the male witches, but 90% of the time it's the female ones, and they're always, like, going to bat for each other, and it's like girlhood.
Yeah, and they honestly always win in the end, which is why, like, we see witches to be the most powerful in the show.
Yeah. But no, overall, it's a great portrayal of witches, and I think that's, I mean, the reason we wanted to talk about it, because we see a lot of these themes in class being tied back to, like, I'm a huge fan of the show. I was like, oh, that reminds me of, like, Bonnie, and, like, this thing that happened to her, or, like, this quote that was from the show, like, the spirits and feeling them all around you, and that kind of thing. But yeah, overall, that was kind of everything I needed to say about it, everything that was relevant.
No, I fully agree. I think it's just, like, a very positive portrayal of witches, and although it's not historically accurate, it is just, like, a fun example of witches.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, 100%. The end.